last a little more than a year ago. Time is a very loose construct these days, so I don't really know how long ago it was. But yeah, and so in terms of covering the environment, that is an incredibly broad umbrella that includes air quality, water quality, wildlife, green space, forests, recycling, pretty much obviously climate change, agriculture being in Indiana. So an incredibly broad umbrella. And another topic that falls in there is environmental justice. And that is a topic in and of itself, but it also is completely interwoven with all of those other topics that I mentioned. And so that's something that we are always incredibly conscious of when we're writing stories, whether that is the focus of the story itself or it is a component of the story. That's something that we're always thinking about. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit today about, kind of environmental justice from the reporting point of view in terms of how we look at that, how we report on that, talk to you about a couple stories that I've written where that was kind of a major focus of the story. And yeah, then any questions, I can go over those later. So give me a second here to share my screen. Okay. Let's see. Nope. There it is. Okay. Let's see. Are you guys seeing my presentation here?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, perfect. All right, so that's just me, and there's my contact information if anyone wants to write that down, or of course, Rachel and Nafisa and folks can, make that available afterwards. Okay, so first question of environmental justice. What is environmental justice? So this here is from the EPA's website, but it's, the fair treatment and involvement of all groups in figuring out how do we create, how do we implement, how do we then enforce environmental rules, regulations, programs, whatever it may be. And as it says here, that goal is achieved when the same environmental protection is applied equally across the board. And also there's equal involvement to that decision-making process in terms of the policies and programs and rules that are created, how they're implemented, how they are enforced. So all groups are also involved in that process. It seems really common sense and really obvious, but it is anything but in terms of figuring out how do you actually account for decades of environmental injustices. So basically environmental justice is kind of preventing and protecting against environmental injustice. So then when we get to environmental injustice, that is this idea of the disproportionate exposure of certain groups, often low-income groups, communities of color, to pollution and the health effects and various effects of pollution, to climate change and the impacts there as we see increased severe storms and flooding, or temperatures rising and having these incredibly hot days, and the various other effects of climate change. That's looking at a lack of access to green space in terms of, where are our parks in the city or our green space, trees and things, having unequal and inadequate access to that. And it's also looking at kind of from the government side of things, that there are laws that unequally protect certain groups or kind of forget about certain groups. So it's how do those things unfairly or unjustly apply across the board. So that's kind of more the idea of environmental injustice, which I think when a lot of people say environmental justice, they're kind of often thinking of these injustices. that certain people and communities and groups are experiencing. And so you can obviously, when we think of environmental injustices, we can think of historical ones, in terms of, or things that have been in place for decades. And that's looking at power plants and various industrial facilities, that are many, many years old, and where are they located in, again, often communities that are where the people who live there are lower income, or communities of color. And you could also look at infrastructure and how that access to clean water, for example, and lead pipes. Again, those are things that are decades old, and certainly things that need to be addressed, fixed, looked at. How do we address and rectify those injustices from long ago? But there also are environmental justices that are still happening in decisions that are made every day. Again, that can be when looking at where is a new park placed, looking at who has access to that park, where is it, who are the community, what are the communities around that. That can also be, again, in terms of climate change, as we start putting in place policies, making sure that they really take into account the communities that are disproportionately affected, and how do we make sure that they have protections that are there. And I think one of our other panelists, Rachel, I believe, is maybe going to talk a bit about flooding and those sorts of things. But so it's not just looking at the historical wrongs and addressing those, but in policies and decisions that are made today, how are we conscious of this, so that we don't make a decision today that's going to be perpetuated into the future. So those are some of the things that I report on, to hold decision makers accountable and to bring to light injustices from the past, so that they can be, to give a voice to these communities that so often have been and felt overlooked by government and powers that be. And so those are the things I report on. So that brings me into kind of the big project that I did recently, earlier this year, that really looked at environmental justice along the White River here in Indianapolis. And so I don't know how many of you have heard of the Dig Indy project. So this is a project here in Indianapolis. We have, as many cities do, what are called CSOs, or combined sewer overflows. So this means that when we get a lot of rain in the city, and it really doesn't take very much, it's about 1/4 inch of rain across the city, we have a bunch of sewage, human waste, that dumps into our waterways along the White River and various creeks and tributaries throughout the city. And it smells and it is gross, and you may think this is something that, how could this possibly happen in modern day society? And it does. So a project was put in place called the Dig Indy Tunnel, and it's a 28-mile long tunnel that they're building underneath the city, and it kind of follows, the river and the tributaries hundreds of feet down. And what this project does is that when it rains, instead of this sewage dumping into the waterways, and obviously tremendous health and environmental problems there, it will overflow into this tunnel instead and stay there until it can be cleaned and treated and then released out into the river and the waters. But so when I first got here, I started working on stories about this tunnel, just giving various status and project updates and that sort of thing. And kind of the more that I learned about it, I learned that this tunnel actually did not come from environmental concerns. I mean, that certainly was part of it. But this tunnel actually originated because of problems with civil rights abuses. And so, so what had happened was in the 1990s, some community groups came together and filed a complaint with the EPA because these sewer overflows were disproportionately impacting low-income communities and communities of color. And one example of that, and it's included in the story here, and so it's available to everyone. You don't need a subscription if you want to look it up. But there actually was a tunnel in the 1980s. There, a white affluent community in kind of northern Indianapolis along the river was experiencing some sewer overflows, and they complained to the city. And so a tunnel was built. This is not the Dig Indy tunnel, this is a different tunnel. A tunnel was built from that community in northern Indianapolis down kind of along a trail here in Indy, and dumped it into Fall Creek, which is a community, predominantly Black community and low income community, a community that already was overrun by sewer overflows and had been complaining themselves and falling on deaf ears. And so that tunnel was put in place, essentially shifting the sewer overflows from this white affluent community down into this low income and minority community. And so that was in the 1980s. That wasn't in the 1920s or, before the 1950s and 60s. That was in the 1980s. And so this complaint was filed in the 1990s about the disproportionate impact. And ultimately, this agreement came about, which was what is the Dig Indy Tunnel. And so for this story, I went back and I did a lot of research, went through a lot of archives from that time. And it was really interesting because the city pushed back on this. I mean, the city really pushed back on this project and this tunnel and having to make these changes. And they said that the tunnel was going to be, it was too expensive of a project and there wasn't really going to be corresponding benefits. But it was kind of more, it just wasn't benefits for communities that they felt were worth it. One of the other things at the time that the city said was that they weren't being intentionally racist. And so that made it okay, that they weren't, intentionally trying to direct and put this sewage in this community because they, didn't like this community or look down on this community, and that made it okay. And so that was kind of some of the really, when I say interesting, but just to go back and see some of the conversations and the discussions that were being had at that time. But ultimately, this consent decree was put in place that brought about the Dig Indy Tunnel. And so it is being built right now. It's still in the process. It is supposed to be completed in 2025, I believe. And so now there's a big conversation that's happening where there's now what's called the White River Vision Plan. For so long, the White River had kind of been forgotten in Indy. There was, jokes about if you put a foot in the water, it's going to turn green and fall off. And, it's so kind of gross and contaminated. But now that this project is in place that's really cleaning up the river, there's this effort to kind of return to and revitalize the White River and really have development along it, have it be a place where there are restaurants and shops and people can come and walk and really engage with the White River, which is a great thing. We have this beautiful resource here and people should engage with it. But it is now raising a question of these communities that for so long have lived along a dirty, contaminated, sewage-filled river. Are they going to be part of this process of reinvigorating the White River? Are they going to be be able to enjoy the benefits of the cleaner river and of this revitalization? Or are they going to be forgotten? Are they going to be pushed out by gentrification of, again, more affluent folks all of a sudden now wanting to locate next to the river because it's clean and it's a, beautiful place to be? And are they going to be pushed out? And after having lived with this for so long, are they not going to be able to enjoy it and be a part of it? And so that is a conversation that's ongoing. It's still happening right now. The city, continues to say that that is important to them and they want to include those communities in this process of both the and that kind of gets back to this environmental justice idea. They want to include the communities in the conversation of how do we revitalize the river? How do we make this a place that people want to be? And making sure that certain programs and things are in place, that even if property taxes go up, there are programs to help them be able to still pay those taxes and be able to keep their homes and that sort of thing. But of course, a lot of folks, have concerns. A lot of folks are hesitant. And after seeing historically what the city has done, they're, not the most optimistic or trustful that the city is going to do that, is going to follow through on its word. And so that's, something that, again, that accountability, it takes, these folks continuing to speak up. We are doing our part to try and continue to give them that voice so that, the city has to listen to them. The city, can't just kind of say, oh, no, we're going to do that. And, have made that promise, but, oh, well, if no one's really checking in on it, then, we can kind of go about and do it the way we want. So, that was certainly a story or a project really, and quickly talk about another story here in a second before I wrap up, but where the environmental justice is the heart of that story. That kind of really is the key of walking out this project and really kind of going into this history that not many people knew about their city. And another big part of that story was the city owning up to it. The city still has really not acknowledged. I mean, there are people here and there, but the city as a whole has not really acknowledged this history. And there's really kind of this feeling from a lot of people that before they do that, they can't move forward in a way that is kind of inclusive and comprehensive. And another part of this story was looking at redlining along the White River. And for those, I'm sure most of you know, but redlining was a policy that began in the 1930s across the country. And different communities, you can see a bit of the redlining map in the background there, and different communities were assigned essentially kind of values, if you will. And this was a government program, and it was later learned, but, so they would say certain communities were a very high value, certain communities kind of mediocre. And then there were these redlined communities where it would be incredibly difficult to, get mortgage help and loans and that sort of thing. And so those were kind of the communities where certain groups were, again, low income and minority communities were kind of pushed into these areas. And again, you may think, well, waterway, that's really nice. Who wouldn't want to live on a waterway? But in Indianapolis, there's a pretty stark line along the White River where when, if here's industry, below industry are redlined communities, above industry are some of the highest valued communities. And so, and again, you can see, industry, there was actually a law in, can't remember off the top of my head actually right now if it was Indiana as a whole or just Indianapolis, but it actually required pollution to be dumped into the river. And it, so there were all these various things at play. Again, there were the sewer overflows. There were, back in the day in Indy, there were meat packing plants that basically just, discarded of entrails and animal parts in the river. And so, in those areas of the river where the river was obviously incredibly contaminated, smelly, dangerous, that is where the redlined communities were. But if you went farther up the river, and we did an analysis of this, that is where historically, when looking at these maps, that is where some of the highest value neighborhoods were. And so we did an analysis where we looked at those communities today, and does that still hold true? Is there this clear distinction of, these higher income and property value and that these, nicer communities in these historically valued areas? And then what about these communities that have been historically redlined? It's the same today. I mean, it still holds these decades later, where when you look at, in Meridian Hills, that was actually the community where they created that pipe in the 80s, but that has, you know, the highest property value in the county, second highest median income. Also, its life expectancy is one of the highest in the county. But one of the only numbers that it's very low on is community or people of color. It has a very low percentage of people of color in that community. And so you kind of follow the White River down and that stays roughly the same. And then you kind of reach this point where it switches. And that was kind of the area where historically industry and those sorts of things were, and it makes that switch. And all of a sudden, property value goes way down. Median income goes way down. Life expectancy goes way down below the average. And people of color, the percentage of people of color in those communities goes way up. And so we can see that decades later, even though much of that industry isn't there anymore, those patterns still hold. They're so entrenched that it's not impossible, but it takes such active work to address those and to reverse those. And again, that's something that is part of this White River Vision plan that people are calling for, of, hey, acknowledge that this happened, acknowledge that this is our history, and doing, what we can to be very conscious of programs that are in place, affordable housing, not letting gentrification just take over these communities. And so that's just one example, that package that we did, I think it was out in May, that we did, where we really took a look at environmental justice. But, in terms of reporting on environmental justice, as I said at the beginning, every single story has a sense of environmental justice to it. And these are just some examples that I have on the screen. So obviously the White River stories. I've also written stories about power plants and coal plants, and they have these coal ash ponds, which is where they put the waste from that process. And it has all these really heavy metals, dangerous chemicals, and most of these ponds are unlined. And so it just leaches into the water, and a lot of the communities that live around these plants are on well water. And so it gets into the water that they drink. So that's one that I've reported on. Speaking of power plants, you look at the communities that are living around these power plants, again, low income, communities of color often, and they have higher rates of asthma, of heart and lung disease, because they're breathing in, they're directly breathing in this air pollution before it dissipates. Or around highways, if you're driving by highways and you often look at the houses there, these are communities that used to be vibrant communities that then were slashed through with a highway, because it was often a community of color or a low income community. And they thought, well, hey, we can put that highway through there. No one's going to notice, no one's going to care. And then they're exposed to all of that exhaust that comes off of, out of the cars and the trucks and that sort of thing. Again, with climate change, you've got flooding, you've got rising temperatures, these heat islands, and that relates to access to green space, because green space, trees, all of those sorts of things help cool, down a city, as opposed to having all of this pavement that just absorbs and puts out this heat. And so, that can mitigate the effects of climate change, as well as green space. Also, just studies have shown it's, good for mental and physical health. And if folks, if they have to walk or drive several miles to get to the nearest park or nearest green space, that is a disproportionate effect there. And it also can be looking at things like various programs to help folks. I mean, solar energy is a big one, and it actually can really help reduce energy bills, but there's an upfront cost there that many people can't afford. So what programs are in place to help those folks, or helping with energy efficiency, weatherproofing a home, that sort of thing, or helping folks with their utility bills, water, energy, electricity, that sort of thing. And so when reporting on environmental justice, I mean, for me as a reporter, but this is something for just everyone to keep in mind, you know, it's this question of who are the people involved in this story, or in you know, this, what's going on, this project, whatever it may be. And it's, you know, not just talking to the talking heads, if you will, or kind of the officials. That is certainly an important perspective to have in there, but it's, you know, always need to think about really getting out into the community and really talking to the folks that, you know, are bearing the brunt or the impacts of the decision that is being made. And, you know, for so long, these communities have been ignored by their government. And so it's about giving them the voice that they kind of haven't had for so long, and helping them get that out there. And the last thing I just want to end on is, in terms of that voice, these communities have had a voice. I mean, they are fighting for their communities. They are fighting for themselves. You know, that one thing that I frequently encounter when I work on these stories is that I think when thinking about these stories or these communities, you know, there's a very, you know, this kind of feeling like, well, everything is horrible, that community, you know, who would want to go there? Who would want to live there? It's just dirty, you know, it's gross, all of these things. And that often is not the case. These are still vibrant communities with such a strong network of people, of the people who live there and for so long have lived there and have fought for their community. And there really is a really great fabric there and incredible resilience. And so that's just another thing to not lose in reporting of these stories, to really bring out the kind of joy and the triumph where possible as well, and remind folks that, yeah, these aren't just kind of completely dilapidated, downtrodden communities, but there are people and there is something worth fighting for there. So that's kind of my presentation in terms of reporting on environmental justice, and look forward to answering any questions y'all may have later on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this great and honestly heartbreaking presentation. For those who joined a little late, please don't hesitate to write any questions you have in the chat. Our panelists will answer them at the end of the presentation. And so thank you again. And Rachel, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nafisa. Hello, everyone. So yeah, this is how I usually feel on Mondays. So that's what you see, but I'm happy to be here. And this is definitely bringing up my spirits. I was so grateful to see Sarah's talk because it aligns really well with what I'm going to talk about now. So today I'm going to talk about my pathway to environmental justice scholarship and activism. So first I'll talk a little bit about where I've been. I grew up in Los Angeles. The Lakers were the champions this year of the NBA. I went to undergraduate at University of California, Santa Barbara. I got an environmental studies degree, and I did an internship at Johns Hopkins at the School of Public Health, where I studied environmental health. And now I'm at Purdue, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Agricultural and Biological Engineering department. I also threw up the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center here because I've learned a lot of my skills here that help me to integrate the social and environmental aspects of my research. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about my background. I told you I grew up in LA. I frequently went to the beach. In undergrad, I even had a chance to go on a research cruise along the coast of California. So I was on this like huge ship. There was a submarine on the ship. I didn't get to go into the submarine, but it was like an amazing experience. And when I told my family about this experience, they were just in utter shock, really. They just kept telling me, show me the videos. You know, I've never been that far out in the ocean. Tell me about, you know, what you're learning. And I find it quite interesting because my family grew up in Daytona Beach, Florida. And they grew up in a place where they were 1 mile away from the beach, but due to segregation, due to Jim Crow laws, they could not actually go to the beach. So I'm showing here a picture of my aunt Yvonne on the left-hand side of the screen. And she too grew up in Daytona Beach in a segregated town. But 50 years later, she ended up becoming the mayor of Daytona Beach, Florida. And famously, she said, she demanded when she got into the mayor's office, I want my office to face the shore. I want to see the waves. I want to see the water. No other office will suffice for me. So that's the legacy of my family. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you have a silhouette of myself and my cousin. And we're on the beach in Daytona. Of course, it's not segregated anymore, but as Sarah talked about, these segregation practices do have legacies that still are lasting. So I did want to talk a little bit about what is going on in Indiana. So segregation and redlining, as you saw in Sarah's presentation, is not only a Southern practice. Eugene Williams was a 17-year-old who grew up in Chicago, Illinois. And in 1919, he was swimming in Lake Michigan, and he accidentally drifted to the wrong side of the segregation line. And literally, this means that the line of segregation was in the water in Lake Michigan, on the coast of Chicago. So he drifted into the white part of Lake Michigan, and a white beachgoer threw rocks at him to the point where he drowned. And it's a hard story to share, but I think it really shows how race and racial relations are intertwined with the environment. This was a young boy trying to enjoy the beach, enjoy the lake, and due to race relations and hate and racism, he lost his life that day. We can also look towards, that was in Illinois near Chicago, but we can also look towards examples in Indiana of these segregated freshwater areas. So this is a picture of Marquette Beach in northern Indiana, Gary, Indiana. This beach was segregated throughout the 1920s and 1930s. They built this little park along the Indiana dunes where for white people. And then they built like a separate but equal, they always say but equal, but it's not usually equal, but they built a separate park for Black people where they didn't actually have beach access, but they only gave them like this little wading pool. And I guess that was supposed to be equal. There's also another example in Indiana, which is Dunes State Park, where Black people were segregated from this space, but it wasn't written into law. Anyone could go to the beach, but it's usually racist practices that prevented Black people and other people of color from actually going. So one group of Black people did actually go in the late 1930s. They went to Dune State Park Beach and they tried to have a picnic there. The lifeguard let them in. They paid their access fee and everything, but the lifeguard told them to go so far away from the lifeguard station that if there were an emergency, he or she would not be able to help. So it's these types of practices that keep people from keep people of color from enjoying natural spaces. And famously, one of the people from the group said, "Is this Indiana or Alabama?" reflecting the Jim Crow laws that they previously experienced in the South. So what does beach accessibility look like today? somewhat similar. So this is a map that just came out in 2020. And you could see this is Lake Michigan. You could see the shores of Chicago and northern Indiana in the south. So when you look at Chicago, and just to orient you to this map a little bit, the darker blue colors in the counties up here, or the towns here, mean that there's a higher white population. And once you get to the more white colors, there's a higher minority population. So when we look at beach accessibility along those lines, we can see that when we're getting to the north side of Chicago, it's highly exclusionary when it comes to beach access. So what does this look like? Of course, there's no law in place, but they do have, within their beaches, they'll be restricted to residents of that neighborhood, or you would have to pay to actually park there, or pay an entrance fee to the beach. And once we get down further south in Chicago, we can see that these beaches have public access. So now when we look at Indiana as an example, we see that most of our beaches or shorelines have public access, but we do still see some legacies of those past practices in around Dune Acres. So recently, actually, a reporter went to Dune Acres Beach and just talked about what the beach looks like and what the accessibility was like. And they reported that, you know, there's only one street to get to the beach. So there's not multiple points of access. There's no public transit that you can take to reach this beach. There's very limited parking. And they have like a security guard post at the entrance of the beach. So when they reached the security guard post, the security guard turned them around and said, you know, this is for residents only, which is not true. But those are the racist practices, exclusionary practices that are going on in that beach today. That incident was actually this year. So my background and my experiences with segregated environments definitely influenced my scholarship. I began to ask myself, how do histories of segregation influence who's involved in environmental management? How do these histories of segregation influence how my family chooses to be involved in environmental management? And within my research, these two major themes have emerged. And one is that water embodies patterns of social inequality. And in result, water drives concerns about and participation in water management. And the second one is that water shapes socio-political processes. And I hope that throughout this talk, you'll be able to see how these themes are coming up within my work. So I work primarily, in terms of my dissertation research, I work primarily on stormwater. And stormwater, Sarah talked a little bit about stormwater when it comes to CSOs. Stormwater is basically the water that collects on surfaces when it rains. And you can see in the top left-hand corner, this is a CSO overflow into someone's basement. You can also see stormwater flowing out of pipes on the street. You can see stormwater flooding streets and residential areas as well. So the question that drives my research is, does social marginalization influence participation in stormwater management? So oftentimes, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is used as a framework to analyze how environmental concerns differ by socioeconomic status. The idea is that environmental concerns are high order concerns. So the environment is only thought about after your basic needs like food, water, shelter are met. But recent scholars have pointed out that environmental concerns can actually be at the base of this pyramid. Environmental concerns reflect your accessibility to food, your accessibility to water. Storms and flooding can destroy your shelter. So these are really concerns that are at the base of this pyramid, which started to debunk this theory of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So although Maslow's hierarchy of needs has been largely refuted, it's still popular to assume that people of color and low-income people are not concerned about the environment. There was a recent study conducted a couple of years ago, and this study is basically showing that the concern of on the y-axis here is environmental concern, and on the x-axis, I'm seeing that my internet is unstable, my Wi-Fi. So I hope y'all can hear me still, but I'll keep going. So yeah, on the x-axis, we have different groups of people based on like their race or their income. So you can see the first bar here is the public perception of their environmental concern. And the second bar is their self-reported environmental concern. So what you can see here is that Latinos, low-income people, Black people, they rated their self-reported concern for the environment much higher than the public rated their concern for the environment. And if you only look at those green bars, you see that people of color have the highest concern for the environment. So now to my own work, my recent work on my own dissertation. I analyzed community surveys in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I measured people's willingness to pay for stormwater remediation, and I measured their concern for flooding. And what we see is that people of color, again, are more willing to be involved in the process than white people in terms of like willing to pay more to address flooding problems, address water quality problems. People of color are more willing. And then when we look to concern for flooding, we see the same pattern. People of color are more concerned for flooding. So at the macro level, we concluded that people of color are actually living in the highest risk places for flooding and for detrimental water quality. So living in these high-risk spaces influences their concern for flooding and also their willingness to change their circumstances. So it sounds really simple, but it's actually, I think it points towards how we are feeding off of our environment, and we're building relationships with the environment based off of the places that we live in, the communities that we live in, and the environmental impacts that we experience. So now I'll briefly shift a little bit to the work that I do as an activist. So I'm also part of the Younger Women's Task Force of Greater Lafayette. And this is a picture of us attending the recent meeting with the Lafayette mayor on climate. And after this meeting, we decided to put together a list of principles for environmental justice that I wanted to share with you all today. So the first one is that we believe in the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and/or people of color in the environmental justice movement. We work towards the dismantling of racism, patriarchy, and classism in environmental justice. We affirm the deep wells of knowledge in us all. We work to decolonize our environmental justice. Reproductive justice is deeply intertwined with environmental justice. The last thing I want to talk about is that last principle. Reproductive justice is intertwined with environmental justice. Reproductive justice is the major framework of the Younger Women's Task Force. And you can see we went to a conference here called Let's Talk About Sex, which was a reproductive justice conference. Reproductive justice is the human right to bodily autonomy, the right to have children, not have children, and parent children that we do have in safe communities. So we decided to kind of fuse environmental justice and reproductive justice as our framework, because these both offer us a chance to focus on how the environment impacts the body specifically, like your physical body, but also how the environment impacts, how environmental conditions impact if and how we can reproduce our cultures and maintain our communities. And ultimately, our efforts to protect the integrity of the natural world are in and of itself efforts to protect ecosystems that sustain our lives. And I think that's a phenomenal end that we've come to, or maybe it's a means that we've come to address some of the issues that we're facing in environmental justice around the greater Lafayette area and Indiana widely. So I want to leave you all with some pointers on how to get involved. Talk about this to your community, your friends, your family. Second thing is advocate for interdisciplinary coursework and programs. Interdisciplinary programs are being attacked at Purdue right now. And these are the spaces where I've learned a lot of the concepts that I use in my research. So I think these spaces need to be protected for all of us. The last thing is follow some advocacy groups. So of course there's the Younger Women's Task Force, but there's also Hoosier Environmental Council, which has a pretty deep focus on environmental justice. There are lots of others, and I know some of you are already in advocacy groups, but these are the groups that I follow closely. Thank you.
Thank you. My sister's clapping in the back. Dr. Wells, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead with your presentation.
Okay. Let me just open it up here. Let's see. All right, looks like I'm sharing now. All right, so I want to first thank everyone for putting together this panel and for inviting me to come to it. I am very excited to not only share with you some of what my students and I have been working on over the past couple years and what we will be working on in the future, but I'm also excited to meet everyone else here who is excited and interested in similar things. I think my perspective on this is that there have been a lot of people around Purdue who've been interested in environmental justice for a while, but we haven't talked to each other as much as we could have. So events like this are really great in getting that moving. So I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm Ellen Wells. I'm an associate professor. I have a master's of public health. That's what the MPH stands for on this slide here. My department is the School of Health Sciences within Purdue University, and specifically within the School of Health Sciences, I'm in the program of occupational and environmental health. My training is in environmental epidemiology. When I was the age that most of you are now, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, but I knew that I was interested in environmental issues, and I knew that I was interested in health issues. And it wasn't until after I graduated and started encountering environmental health topics as I was working with various environmental groups or various health groups, I kept seeing how the environment and health work together, and that there was a lot of people in the field of environmental health to specialize within that. So I decided to specialize in environmental health as an epidemiologist. I assume since COVID has been so prevalent that most of you have heard about epidemiology by now, but briefly, it's the science where we look at the rates of disease among populations. So among populations, what does the health of a population look like? So in terms of environmental epidemiology, my role is to understand what kind of environmental risks are faced in the population, what kind of health conditions do they cause. And ultimately what we want to get to is how can we prevent disease and how can we treat disease. I'm not going to talk about the bulk of my research here. I'm going to talk about a project related to environmental justice I've been working on, but most of my work has centered on looking at populations' exposure to metals, including lead, which is ubiquitous and still has a huge impact on our society still, but ironically, a lot of people keep forgetting that it's here. I also look at mercury. Mercury is another contaminant, and we're facing a potential increase in mercury lately due to choices that politics have made. I also look at manganese exposure and other metals, and I have a little bit of experience in working with climate change and health as well as air pollution and health, but not as much as working with metals and their effect on both neurodegeneration at the end of life as well as neurodevelopment towards the beginning of life. So I thought I'd share some facts about environmental health with all of you briefly as I get started. I apologize if I'm sharing information that I may have told you or others may have told you before, but this is a relatively recent report that came out from the World Health Organization, and they did a very detailed analysis of causes of death globally. And the take-home message was 24% of all global deaths are linked to the environment. In my opinion, this is actually an underestimate, and I'll tell you a couple of reasons why. So the World Health Organization, as most large government or quasi-governmental organizations do, they're very conservative with their estimates. So when they came up with the 24% of all global deaths are linked to environment, they only include environmental factors for which we have huge amounts of evidence about them. So they did include things like lead and air pollution in their analysis, but what they didn't include are emerging pollutants that we have limited information on. I could go on and on about what they didn't include. So they didn't include much more than they did include, but even though they only included a small fraction of the environmental factors, they still came up with an estimate of 24% of global deaths are linked to the environment. So I think that's pretty telling. And another reason I think it's an underestimate, before I move on from this slide, is that a lot of environmental factors don't work alone. They work in combination with other health risk factors, such as access to medical care, health behaviors, genetics, and that whole spectrum of other factors too. So that makes it more challenging to actually come up with an exact number of how much does it contribute if it's contributing part of a complex picture. And so this is also from the same report I just mentioned. And one of the things I wanted to emphasize on this slide here is that if you look at where the World Health Organization identified the environmental burden of global mortality, there's a much higher burden in countries that in Southeast Asia and in Africa, in countries that are have tended to be lesser developed over time. And this is a cartoon I've used in teaching about environmental justice in some classes. I think this is a really distinct way of describing over time how the problem of environmental injustices happened, in that over time, people who are wealthy like to live in clean neighborhoods and have more power and agency to make that happen, whereas people who are poorer or minorities have less agency and political power and less ability to prevent having waste placed near their homes. So I also wanted to share some examples of across the United States of how the environment and particularly race are intertwined here. So before I get into these statistics, for example, it actually took me a while to find these, because despite the fact that this is a really important issue, just bare statistics on how environmental issues and health are related are actually pretty hard to find. So race is the #1 predictor of the placement of toxic facilities in the US. And by toxic facilities, people are talking about things like energy plants, factories, waste sites, and that sort of thing. And this has been shown in a variety of different studies in different parts of the country, usually like a statewide study or a region-wide study, looking at a variety of factors, including race, usually income is included, and that sort of thing. There are unequal rates of childhood lead poisoning. Lead poisoning is one of the topics I research a lot, as I mentioned earlier. And African American children have much higher rates of lead poisoning than white and Caucasian children. And a lot of this is due to the ongoing structural inequalities faced in various neighborhoods. Back in the day when lead was used in paint, which is the cause of childhood lead poisoning in many cases, it was ubiquitous, but the neighborhoods that white and Caucasian children live in tend to have more resources, so those lead paint sources have been cleaned up or protected more. And so what we get is unequal rates of lead poisoning that persist to this day. And also, as pointed out by some of the other speakers, African Americans have a 54% higher health burden from air pollution. Study after study has shown that air pollution is much higher in parts of the country that have higher African American or minority populations. And this is a slide I came across relatively recently from a group called Break the Cycle. And since the others have emphasized this, I'm not going to emphasize this here, but the idea with this slide was I wanted to really emphasize how environmental injustice is a cycle, and it has roots in history, but then it reinforces itself over time. So you can have social and economic causes leading to limitations on where people can live, and then those residential characteristics can cause issues on political access or social access, access to healthcare, access to environmental factors, and then they have an environmental impact leading to health factors, confounding factors, which then makes it more difficult for subsequent generations to break out of the cycle. And this is why you see health disparities persisting a lot over time. So some of the work I've been doing recently, I've been working on an environmental injustice project related to a Superfund site in East Chicago, which is a town that's right next to Gary. So Gary is right there as well. So you can see on the map of Indiana on the right hand of the slide, Lake County is highlighted in tan, and East Chicago is that little red dot there at the top. And East Chicago qualifies as a lower income, high minority kind of area. And the statistics I have up here are just to convince you of that. Much higher minority Hispanic population than the rest of the state, much higher proportion of people who are living in poverty. And also a really shocking characteristic here is Lake County as a whole, this little county, is the 11th highest chemical releases, and this is in terms of metric tons, within the whole United States in 2018. So looking at all the counties across the entire United States, Lake County had the 11th highest amount of emissions, and most of it is from this northeastern corner in the top, where a lot of people live and a lot of lower income and minority people live. So this area has over a century of pollution that they're dealing with. There are, in the county, there are 7 Superfund sites compared with 40 Superfund sites in all of Indiana. So a lot of them are really concentrated in this region. In addition to that, there are 423 hazardous waste sites, 460 underground storage tanks, and currently the community has an active steel mill, oil refinery, metal recycling, chemical manufacturing, and coal-fired power plants in the area, all of which are still contributing to pollution in the area. So I first became aware of the environmental injustice issues in East Chicago in around 2015, when newspaper articles that were published in the Northwest Indiana Times and elsewhere started to make a big splash in the media. And so this is another map of, this is just Lake County, and this is a little inset looking at, here is the Superfund site that I've been focused on. It's called the USS-led Superfund site, and I'll show you a larger picture of it in a minute. But again, the photos here, this is a historic photo of the region, showing the many factories in there, and that the many factories that at the time, a century ago, right, at the beginning of the 1900s, there were no environmental rules. So they could just pollute as much as they wanted to in order to increase industry, and there was no controls on that whatsoever. So they did. And as a result, there are a lot of Superfund sites and brownfields. Brownfields are also waste sites, but they're dealt with through a different process than Superfund sites, mainly involving less lawyers is really the big difference. So what happened here is that there is a Superfund site, the USS-led Superfund site. The map on the left shows you kind of the layout of the Superfund site. The USS-led was a primary lead smelter that operated for close to 80 years in this area. Most of it was prior to the EPA or any environmental rules being existing. So it was a lead smelter that operated without any sort of environmental control whatsoever. And they closed down around sometime in the 1980s, right around the time the EPA was put in, but the contamination had already really been in place. We also have DuPont land over here, and they're still active, and they make pesticides and insecticides, some of which also include lead. So what happened here, and I'm going to abbreviate a timeline a fair bit, was in 2015, the residents in this area first became aware of the fact that they were literally living in a Superfund site. Many of them had been living there for decades, but didn't know that it was a Superfund site. So on the map, you see the USS-led. This is where the factory was, and this is where the DuPont factory is. But the areas that are labeled 1, 2, and 3 are residential areas, and they are all officially part of the USS-led Superfund site because there was documented contamination in the soil, specifically of lead and arsenic at the time. And to elaborate on this a little bit more, this area, the first that's labeled 1, most of this was a low-income housing complex. And then at the top in the top left corner of the zone 1 was an elementary school. An elementary school had been built there in the 1980s and had operated through 2015. Literally in a Superfund site where there had been a primary lead smelter operating for decades. So the residents first found out about this. EPA and the state knew that there was lead pollution in this area for a while. They'd known a little bit about it. They'd known about it since the 1980s, actually, but their reports kept saying that everything was under control. There was no issue. A 2012 report from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry said that the children weren't really exposed to elevated lead concentrations. However, they neglected to actually test a lot of people who were actually living in this area, and they just relied on numbers from the city as a whole. When children were tested in the area, the numbers were much higher. So finally, some additional soil testing near the school in the low-income housing complex revealed very shocking levels of lead and arsenic in the soil. So in 2015, what caught everyone's attention was the fact that the EPA declared that this elementary school that had been open for decades suddenly had to be closed, and this low-income housing complex in Zone 1 suddenly had to be closed, and everyone was forced to move out somewhere else with short notice. And then the EPA put up signs: no one is allowed to play in the dirt or around the mulch, all up through Zone 1, Zone 2, and Zone 3. And in the past 5 years since they've announced this, they have been slowly working on remediating the area. I'm not going to comment right now on my thoughts about how well they remediated it, but you can probably tell from my comments that I think it was less thorough than it could have been. So what my colleagues and I have been doing, and I want to emphasize, I've been working with some other researchers in Notre Dame University and Valparaiso University, as well as others here at Purdue. We've done things like XRF days. So there's a technology called X-ray fluorescence that can be used to get a fairly quick measurement of metal concentration in soil. And so primarily my colleagues, but I also help them, we organize days where we mention in the newspapers that we would come in with XRF machines, and community members could bring in as many soil samples as they wanted, and we would test them and give them the results. And that's actually been very productive. We just submitted a manuscript based on some information that we learned from that. We've also been participating in meetings that community groups have had. There have been several different community groups in the region that have been really concerned about this. The challenge is that over time, participation and people's ability to maintain a community group waxes and wanes. So they do change a lot, but we have been working with them. And one of the things that my colleagues and I are doing right now, in addition to, we have done the XRF days. One thing, we're reviewing EPA documents. In the past month or so, we've been reading through reports by the third-party contractor who did the remediation, and their report on how well they did the remediation, and that the contractor thinks that they're done. I think there's more they could have done, but that's a different story. I have attended EPA meetings with community members, kind of as support for them, so that they can, I can express my expert opinion in addition to the residents' opinion at a community meeting. We have held focus groups with other community members, and a large part of the focus groups is, I'll get to our eventual goal, is to do a larger scale research study in the area to determine with more precision what environmental exposures and health outcomes are. So one of the things we're doing is focus groups to figure out what kind of things people are concerned about with their environment, and what kind of things that they'd like us to, the community wants us to look into, in addition to what we think is interesting scientifically. And I have to say, I've learned so much by working with these community groups and talking with people. People really do, every person has knowledge of where they live to a greater extent than what I do. So people living in East Chicago know a lot about the history of their environment and how things work in a very different way than the knowledge that I come through having just gone to school and learned a lot about environmental health along the way. We're also trying to work with some schools to do science education projects, but we're running short on time, so I'm going to try and hurry up here. So I'm just going to show you a couple of results from various related projects that some of my students have done over the past couple of years. This was done by one of my undergraduate students who got summer funding to work for me in the summer from the Center for the Environment. They usually have summer funding available for students who are interested in research. So he put in an application to do this work with me. And this is only part of what he did, but he looked at the data that was available from the EPA on soil concentrations and made, one of the things he did was make heat maps of where the soil concentrations were. And one of the things that we concluded from this, not only is zone 1 the heaviest hit area, so anything that's yellow or orange is above the EPA recommended limit, but zone 2 and zone 3 kind of are very similar levels of contamination. But at the time this was done, the EPA was really concentrating on cleaning up zone 3 and putting off zone 2 for later, despite the fact that there's relatively equal amounts of concentration in both. And my sources from the community believe that this has to do with environmental injustices on a much more local level. And that being that people who live in zone 3 tend to be more white than people who live in zone 2, and people who live in zone 3 have more political connections than people who live in zone 2. So, so there's some belief that, you know, even on the scale of within a single Superfund site, that environmental injustice can still play out. So longer term goals, I mentioned this briefly now, that we're in the process of developing a community engaged citizen science research project. We are developing it, we're looking for money right now, as most scientists do. And we're adapting a model that my colleagues have used successfully in Notre Dame to address lead exposure issues. There was a lead poisoning, major lead poisoning issue in Notre Dame. So they have a model with community engaged science, and we're going to work with that. We're going to create an advisory group over the next couple of months. And the goal for our community engaged project is that we will hire and train people from the community to help do the research. It's not just that myself sitting at Purdue in my office is going to do the research. We're going to engage with people who are living in communities to do the research, to participate in the research themselves so that they have more agency in the kind of questions we're asking and the results we get. And so it's more meaningful for everyone too. And so the goals we have are to characterize environmental exposure and human exposures and determine correlations with health outcomes. Personally, I'm really interested in two things. One is long-term exposure. So if people are exposed as children, what does that mean for your lifelong health? And that is admittedly a difficult thing to study. I'm also interested in the impacts of being exposed to many things at the same time, because most of our regulations and laws related to environmental pollution are really based on exposure to one thing at a time. But in reality, and especially in areas impacted by environmental justice, that's not what we see. We see that people in this community have really high levels of lead and arsenic exposure, but they also have exposure to air pollution, volatile organic compounds, and the list goes on of all the environmental injustice issues that they're facing. So I was thinking when I was putting this together of what can you do to get more involved in this? And I think one of the first things that you can do is learn more. And like I said earlier, I've learned a lot about this and I continue to learn. And one of the best places for me to learn is to talk with people who are affected by environmental pollution, because that's a perspective that is really important in figuring out what the priorities are with getting more things done, and also teach others. I think that environmental justice issues have become more prominent in recent years, but a lot of people still aren't completely aware of how prevalent this really is. Like, we have a lot of issues with environmental contamination in the US, but the vast majority of people who are affected is related to environmental injustice issues. So as the others have said, you can join or follow environmental justice organizations, or one thing I decided to do in my career was support research in environmental justice. And as students, you can work on that kind of issues as well. And one of the reasons I'm saying that is for major changes in policy, like changing regulations on how Superfund sites are cleaned up, or big national level regulatory guidelines or such, the government has to have a large body of data on which to base their evidence. And when I started to get into environmental justice research in more depth, I was actually pretty shocked at how little research related to environmental justice in the environmental health world there is. Environmental health scientists talk about environmental justice all the time, but if you look at the bulk of the literature, a lot of it doesn't really highlight issues of environmental justice. So I think we need a lot more of that in the world. And the good news is there's actually a lot of publicly available data that could be used readily to address some of these research needs or data issues. And there's a lot of people who help me out, so I want to give them all full credit for that. And that's all.
All right, awesome. Okay, so before we dive into our Q&A here, I just want to give a big thank you to all of our speakers, Sarah, Rachel, Ellen, for sharing such important research and stories, personal stories, as well as just being such incredible advocates for those facing environmental injustices, and also just facilitating spaces for those people to have their voices be heard. So thank you so much. I know these topics can be really deeply personal and difficult to talk about, but it's conversations like these that are really the first step in not only understanding and empathy, but creating change. So thank you all for being here and doing this type of work. And with that, I'm going to dive into the chat and just start to ask some of the questions in there. If people want to add questions in the chat as I go, you can. Also, when we're done, if you want to give a question in person, I think since there's not like a million people on the Zoom call, I think it's okay for people to actually speak up as well. But I'm going to go in order here. So I think the first question is from Shannon, and she was asking, when you do your research, who are you in contact with the most? Are they environmental justice lawyers or community organizers, both or other? And this question was for, I think, Sarah specifically, but I think everyone can answer this question probably if they would like.
Sure, well, I can hop in and start, and then of course, Rachel and Ellen love their input as well. So for me, it's definitely both. When I start working on a story, I certainly do often first make contact with those environmental justice lawyers, as you mentioned, or some of the various groups that are working on this. Rachel mentioned the Hoosier Environmental Council, and that's one that I am in contact with a lot because they do a lot of work in this space, and they often, are in the communities themselves and have connections to, the communities that are living this and experiencing this. So I certainly will talk with them and ask their help in connecting me with those communities. And part of the reason for that is because often they are hesitant to talk to me, to talk to the media, to talk to a reporter, because for so long they've kind of been ignored by government, by those groups. And so understandably, they kind of, not so sure about me. And so by making that connection through someone that they have been working with and that they, kind of know already, that certainly helps. So it's kind of any and all, just kind of getting in touch with people who are doing work in that community and can help put you in touch with those, who are living there and who are experiencing that, is the way that I usually go about kind of doing that research and making those connections. Short of just getting out there and, knocking on doors and that sort of thing, which I've done too. But like I said, sometimes that doesn't yield as great of results.
Awesome. Okay, Rachel, Ellen, do you guys have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'd say my answer is the same. We've talked with everybody. The initial introductions came through an environmental lawyer who got in touch with us and then introduced us to the community. And again, that was, a big benefit because the trust is just not there necessarily at the beginning. And I'd say community members didn't really trust me until I came to meetings, over and over months at a time, before they really started to open up and tell me things. And interest.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. It's just for my research, it's dissertation research, so it happened over like a year. But I was introduced first to Charlotte Stormwater, which is the municipality, and then through them, I got connections to community members. And I don't have much interaction with lawyers.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, guys. Okay, so next question is from Amy. She was asking, what kind of books or other educational resources would you recommend related to environmental justice?
So I can start. An author that I like is Adrienne Marie Brown. They also have a website that you can look at. There's also, in terms of water and environmental justice, there's I guess a reading package that's called Open Rivers. Open Rivers, Rethinking Water, Place, and Community. And you can find that online. It's free and accessible. Other authors that I like are Dorcetta Taylor, JT Rohn, and podcasts that I listen to are How to Save the Planet, Breaking Green Ceilings. There's also a website, Black Ecologies, which is really great. I would recommend that everyone go look at that website. It's really Black historians that focus on ecology, and they're going through kind of the historical processes that result in environmental injustices. There's also a movie on Netflix, There's Something in the Water, which was created by Ingrid Waldron, who's also a scholar that you can follow, but she made this Netflix movie as well. And she follows Indigenous communities in Canada and their problems with water quality.
Oh, wow. I loved your How to Save a Planet plug. I love that podcast.
Me too. Awesome. I'm such a fan. I love it so much.
Ellen, Sarah, do you guys have any other suggestions for content for people? If not, it's okay. I just wondered.
Rachel hit on some of the ones that I would have recommended. One other book that I might throw out there is, I believe it's called A Terrible Thing to Waste. Is another one that I really like, but yeah, Rachel touched on some of the authors, and yeah, that podcast, How to Save the Planet, is a fave of mine as well.
Nice.
If you're interested in a classic book, Robert Bullard's Dumping in Dixie is credited as one of the first books on environmental injustice topics, and that was with landfills in North Carolina. I think it's just from the 1980s, so I'm like ancient history, but it's only the 1980s that the first really literature on this came out. So
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, Robert Bullard is actually known as the father of environmental justice. So I should read that book. That sounds awesome. Oh, Ellen, I think this question was for you from Nafisa. What is a Superfund site?
oh, I apologize. So a Superfund site is basically an area of land that has been designated as being very highly polluted, and usually it's a result of legacy pollution from that occurred before the creation of environmental laws. So pollution that occurred before the 1980s or so in the United States. And it's administered, it's a very complicated legal system that the idea was if a site gets designated as a Superfund site, there are formal mechanisms to get money in order to clean it up. So the idea was if you designate a site as a Superfund site, that there would be funds available to do the cleaning and restoration process. In reality, most of that money comes from the polluters. So a lot of Superfund is tied up in litigation and legal fees with the EPA lawyers and the potentially polluter lawyers fighting about how much they're going to pay for what, and that can go on for a really long time, as it did with the site in East Chicago. Right, but the idea is it's a pathway so that sites will eventually get cleaned. And I mentioned brownfields briefly. They're similar in that they're a waste site, except that they don't have to be cleaned up to as clean a standard as Superfund sites, and they don't involve nearly as much litigation and blame on having former companies pay for the cleanup. And in exchange, they work more on a negotiating tactic with the companies that maybe have had the pollution in the past, or maybe people who want to use the land so they get it back to not residential type of cleaning, but clean enough that it can be used for industry or other things like that.
Okay, perfect. And we have a question from Katie. Are there any laws specific to Indiana that regulate or try to address these pollution issues in Northwest Indiana, or have there been any major litigations?
So I think that was for me, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I told you to specify.
So I'm not aware of any specific Indiana issues, but they have been going to court quite a lot for the Superfund site. They have a website just specifically for the Superfund site, and they post all of the negotiations on there. They have gone back to the responsible polluters. They call them PRPs, potentially responsible polluters, I think is the lingo. They've gone back at least twice to negotiate with lawyers in a full-on process to figure out how much money they needed to do the cleanup. They did it once and they started the cleanup, realized they didn't have enough money, so they went back and did the whole process over again. And a lot of the residents have gotten together with a class action lawsuit as well. And I don't really know the status of that, but I know that that was also going on.
Okay, interesting.
Hey, Rachel, I'm sorry. My sister's name is Rachel, and so I just said Rach. I apologize. Also, just to quickly jump in, one thing that did happen this past legislative session, and it's not specifically related to this, but it was interesting, is that they passed a law about testing lead in schools, in water fixtures and such across the state. And the only reason I thought of it was because it actually started out of Lake County. It was just brought forward by a Lake County legislator, about getting the water fixtures, taps, drinking fountains, that sort of thing in schools in Lake County tested. And then it was brought in to be the whole state. So that was something that passed this past year. And then of course, kind of with additional parts of the legislation that if it is found above certain levels, things need to be done to address that and take care of that. Obviously, finding the funding for all of those things is another part of it, which the IFA, the Indiana Finance Authority, has offered or given some funding to start that testing and doing that. But again, it's figuring that out and then the funding to take care of it if stuff's found. But that was a little win that happened this past legislative session.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just going to say one other book that I thought of, speaking of lead, was I think it's called What the Eyes Don't See, and it's by Dr. Mona Hannah Atisha, and it's about the Flint lead crisis. She was kind of the doctor that first really, kind of blew the whistle and brought it to the attention there. And that is another great book.
Okay, awesome. I have it written down. Thanks for that. Okay, so, and also the thing about testing water in schools, now that you say that, I think I remember reading about that or having a discussion about that in one of our classes, I think a year ago, and reading about that specifically. So thank you for bringing that up again. And then Mia wanted to know, and this is for, this is for Ellen, how is data collected on the health impacts of lead, arsenic, etc.? Do you send out surveys or do you visit sites and do you do lab testing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a lot of different ways to do the research. What I prefer is to take like blood samples or urine samples to detect how much of the metal people have been exposed to. That's generally more accurate than testing it in soil or something, because just because the lead's in the soil doesn't mean it's going to get in your body, right? So there's a very high correlation, but it's not a direct one-to-one correlation. And in terms of health outcomes, sometimes we can use surveys, but if we're doing, say, neurodevelopmental impacts, there are a lot of standardized tests that we can go through with children, for example, to see to test basically things like IQ, cognitive function, and that sort of thing. So it really depends on what health outcome you're testing for, what kind of method you'd use.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Okay, so this is from Nafisa, and it's a question for Sarah. Do you think the city is planning on giving some sort of reparations to the affected communities?
Excellent question. And I wish I had more of an answer for you. Unfortunately, I don't. As of right now, that's not something that's really been in the rhetoric, or that they've been talking about. That's not to say it's not going to happen or it couldn't happen, but it's not something the city is really committed to or said that they are planning to do kind of at this moment.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. All right. Matthew had a question. He
Rachel,
said, oh,
I just wanted to cut in and say I have to go. I have to do some family things, but thank you all for having me. I tried to answer the questions that I had.
Yes, that's what I was reading. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know we have, I think, 1 or 2 more questions. But if anyone needs to dive out, that is completely fine. I know we're several minutes ahead, past time. So, but thank you so much for coming, Rachel. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all. Good night.
Night. Yeah, and Ellen and Sarah, if you guys need to go, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll just get these last 2 questions in real quick. All right, so Matthew had a question. He said, how do we get policymakers and politicians to listen to research focused on environmental justice more? There's so much research out there, but the actions by policymakers seldom match this effort put out on the academic level.
I mean, I would certainly say, obviously, the media is a big part of that, in terms of, getting that research, getting that information out there. getting the voices of those communities. And I was just reading through Rachel's response as well. And I have not finished reading through it, but you know, she says that a major problem is media, and I don't disagree with her. I mean, I do think it is very hard. As we were discussing earlier, there's a big trust issue that understandably is there. And so to tell these stories, it takes time. It takes, you know, really going to these communities, as Rachel mentioned, as Ellen mentioned, multiple times, showing up at meetings, you know, really taking the time to talk to them, not just a term that is out there in terms of media coverage is called parachuting in, where you just kind of, you know, you parachute in, you talk to a couple people, you tell your story, and then off you go. And that's kind of particularly often talked about in terms of, you know, national media, when they quickly come into a place not really understanding the context or the history and all, you know, that goes along with that community and that issue. And so again, that breeds that distrust. And so in order to tell those stories, you really, like I said, have to invest your time and energy in that community to really be able to tell that story in the way that it deserves and it should be. And so I think a lot of times the easier route, if you will, is to, you know, just talk with the advocacy group and that sort of thing. And not that that's not an important perspective, but it by no means is the whole perspective. And that's not the, you know, the lived perspective of folks from those communities. And so I do think that perhaps plays into that perception that Rachel was talking about. And so I think, to get back to Matthew's question, that, you know, in terms of getting policymakers and politicians to listen to that, again, media plays a big role in that. But at the same time, that also is just our politicians. As much as we put that information out there, if they're not listening, you know, if they're not kind of open and receptive to that. And so, you know, that gets back to this thing that we've all been hearing so much about in terms of reaching out to your politicians and letting them know what's important to you. Even if you are not a member, you know, even if you've not lived that experience, if you let them know that, you know, hey, this is in my community and this is important to me. You know, these are my neighbors, that sort of thing. Obviously, again, with your vote, if there is a politician who has repeatedly not listened to that, you know, do it in that way. And, you know, just kind of doing the work yourself. Obviously, there's so much, you know, there's a huge role for the government to play in policies that address these things. But, you know, there's also so much that you can do in volunteering yourself, you know, in your own time and getting out there.
Awesome. Thank you. That was such a great answer. I think I actually would like to take the moment to actually read Rachel's response to Nafisa's questions, and she couldn't be here to answer it in person because I think it's such a great response. Nafisa asked, why do you think the public believes that minorities don't care as much about the environment? And Rachel said, I think a major problem is media. Media shows white people as the face of environmental movements without acknowledging the history of the mainstream environmental movement, which is very exclusionary. Racist practices keep people of color out of mainstream environmental movement. Also, people of color often point towards different environmental issues as problems for them. Problems like lead poisoning, urban flooding, etc., are not talked about as much in the environmental movement as problems like land preservation, biodiversity, etc. And she said, I have to go see you soon. I think that was a really great answer to that question. It's a really important point, kind of based off of your experiences and who you are, how you view environmental issues and environmental justices. I think it's an important perspective from Rachel. So yeah. That's all the questions I see in the chat, but if anyone has any other quick questions or Nafisa, are you raising your hand? She's got the hand raised thing. Nafisa, you can jump in if you want.
No, I just wanted to thank everyone, the panelists and everyone for your questions. This was, I really had a good time learning about everyone's work, honestly. So thank you, and thank you for everyone who could make it. I've recorded the entire session and the Q&A as well. Hopefully we'll be able to post it on the Purdue Student Government YouTube page. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for being here tonight. I hope you have a wonderful